thanks to the Indusforum, which has been mentioned. And Sunish is the national coordinator of the Indusforum. And the Indusforum invited me to be their distinguished speaker this year and to go on a 6-city tour of the US. So Indusforum has already taken me to Houston, Chicago, Atlanta, Philadelphia, and today, of course, in New York. Tomorrow I leave for DC, and I'm there in DC giving lectures in DC till the 18th when I leave to go back home. So thank you very much to the Indusforum and to Sunish for bringing me here. Thank you to Mr. Thomas Abraham. Had it not been for him, I think we would not have Gopio. So thank you very much for having founded Gopio, and all the work that you did is really extraordinarily important. And thank you also very specially to Mr. Ashok Ramsaran. Where is he? There he is, the president of Gopio. Thank you very much indeed. I think it's great that you've taken the initiative, sir, in organizing not just dance and music and other cultural events, which is of course very good. We should be and are rightly proud of our culture in those areas. But you're also initiating a series of talks and things like that, which generally don't happen. Our community is not known for its dialogues on intellectual topics. I'm very glad that you're initiating this series, this new series of talks and so on it. Now, the topic for our session today is the geo-economic roles of the US and of India in the 21st century. I will not say a lot about India because, of course, my time is limited, and we have such an expert in Dr. Chadha right here, and she'll be speaking, of course, next. So I will leave that largely to her. I will make perhaps a few comments, but mostly I will leave that to her. I will make some observations and reflections on geo-economics, and then I will talk a little bit about the US role in the world today. There are many different aspects of that role, of course. One can talk about the role of the United States in terms of money, not just dollars, but in terms of what kinds of currencies there are in the world. And you know and I know that what currency you earn and spend is extremely important. And whether the dollar you earn is worth what it was at the time you earned it, or worth 99% of that when you choose to spend it, or 90% or 50%, makes a huge difference, doesn't it? And so we could discuss the role of the US in terms of global monetary strategy. We could discuss it in terms of fiscal or financial strategy. That is, should governments, generally speaking, if they are civilized governments, have deficit spending or not? What kinds of taxation policies should be followed? What kinds of subsidy and incentive policies should be followed? We could, of course, discuss that. We could discuss economic strategy. And if we did that, we would be discussing topics like, what do we need to do to get growth? Should we try and spend our way out of the recession, as President Obama is clearly trying to do at the moment with whatever degree of success he can marshal resources? Or should we try and cut our way to success, as Republicans, for example, would like us to do in the United States, particularly the Tea Party? So we could have a very interesting discussion of that, not just in US terms, but in terms of the kinds of policies we should have globally, because, of course, what the United States does today, the world does tomorrow. We could talk about energy strategy. Energy is going to be a huge issue, and other resources, of course, water, oil, and so on. Even fresh air maybe turn out to be a kind of resource that people fight over. We could talk about technology strategy. What is the role of the US in terms of technology globally, not just in the US? Should we be encouraging more technology that we don't need? Should we be encouraging technology just for the rich? Or should we reorient technology so that technology can actually address the problems of the poor, who are, of course, the majority of the world's population? So all these are very interesting debates we could have. We could look at the role of the US in terms of military strategy. We could discuss it in terms of the social, spiritual, cultural kind of dimensions of the world, which are obviously very important. We could discuss law and politics. So these are all dimensions of this issue of geopolitics that we could discuss, and clearly we don't have time for a detailed discussion probably of any of these. But I'll try to address or touch upon some of these aspects as we go through. Let me begin by making some remarks on geo-economics, the very concept of geo-economics. Geo-economics can be defined in two different ways: as the geopolitical consequences of economic phenomenon, or as the economic consequences of geopolitical trends. Now, the interesting thing is that geo-economic competition was forecast to replace geopolitical competition as the focus of great power relations in the post-Cold War world. But that was on an academic or theoretical basis, and academics and theory can tell you a lot about the future, but what they cannot tell you is the timing. Though the phenomenon goes back to the Garden of Eden and the conflict between Cain and Abel, the intellectual roots of geo-economics are embedded in 17th century European, largely French, mercantilism. And mercantilism is the military pursuit of markets, resources, and gold and other such precious resources for a country to be able to export more and import less, or at least export more expensively and import more cheaply. Buy cheap and sell dear. This preceded the advent of modern economics based on ideas of free trade and laissez-faire. Now, while the 19th century was dominated by these ideas of classical political economy, mercantilism was never buried and has repeatedly raised its head in interwar Europe in the 20s and 30s, and of course Japan immediately after the end of the Second World War, a period sort of Japanese rise and dominance from, let's say, 1955, 58 to about 1980, when the real estate bust in Japan seems to have clobbered their rise, and they have never risen again after that, at least not yet. Now, most recently, in the crises, the 2007 crises, Europe and North America seem to have revived latent mercantilism, and of course China has been accused of pursuing a mercantilist agenda. China has been particularly successful at utilizing state policy to attract foreign direct investment in order to develop manufacturing and exports. And in the last decade or so, it has also begun to use state policy to promote outward investment on the part of its firms as they try to go global. Of course, it's also doing that in order to capture resources, and we'll talk about that perhaps in a minute. In the post-war era from 1950 to 1980, international economics and politics were marked by a conflict between ideas of free trade and liberal democracy on the one hand, and those of state-run policies and authoritarianism on the other hand, with a few countries experimenting with a mix between these two ideas, some mixing liberal democracy and state capitalism like India, and others mixing free enterprise with military or one-party rule like the Asian tigers and many Latin American countries, and of course China. But the dominant paradigm in this period, the Cold War era, was one in which politics remained in command and geopolitics was driven by ideological rather than purely economic forces. It's therefore not a coincidence that the three most important ideas defining contemporary geo-economics were all articulated at the time when the Cold War was on the verge of ending or had just ended, and a new era of economic rivalry between nations was started. So the first important articulation of the contemporary geopolitical consequences of post-World War economic trends was Paul Kennedy's study called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, published in 1985 or 7 or something like that, that put forward the theory of imperial overstretch, drawing attention to the fiscal and other economic limits on national power and the projection of national power. It's the particular character of this book, the forward-looking character of this book, the way this book foresaw what was likely to happen is underscored by the fact that it was written at a time when the Cold War had not yet ended. Kennedy put it this way: all of the major shifts in the world's military power balances have followed alterations in the productive balances. And further, that the rising and falling of the various empires and states in the international system has been confirmed by the outcomes of the major great power wars where victory has always gone to the side with the greatest material resources. The second important articulation of the idea of geo-economics was in the 1990 essay of Edward Luttwak, titled From Geopolitics to Geo-Economics, The Logic of Conflict, Grammar of Commerce. And Luttwak put it this way: everyone, it now appears, agrees that the methods of commerce are displacing military methods. With disposable capital in lieu of firepower, civilian innovation in lieu of military and technical achievement, and market penetration instead of garrisons and military bases. States as spatial entities structured to jealously delimit their own territories will not disappear, but will reorient themselves towards geo-economics in order to compensate for their decaying geopolitical roles. And he says geo-economics is the best term I can think of to describe the admixture of the logic of conflict with the methods of commerce. Now, this argument drew attention to the budding neo-mercantilism of the Cold War era, especially on the part of Japan and the architects of the European Common Market, which began to worry the United States quite deeply. The logic of conflict in the methods of commerce was not visible in the statecraft of either the decaying Soviet Union or the China which had not yet arisen. Rather, it was seen in the aggressive export-led growth models of Japan and the Asian tigers, and in the creation of the European Economic Community, that is from the US's point of view. Even though the European Economic Community was primarily for internal purposes rather than initially anyway, it wasn't intended as a competitor to the US, though of course it's ended up being that. And we can discuss the roles of the US versus the roles of Europe, if you wish, in the question and answer panel discussion session later on. Now, a more brutal is the wrong word, a more aggressive, a more sort of forthright statement of this view was Samuel Huntington's 1993 essay, Why International Primacy, being number one, matters, in which he extended Daniel Bell's assertion with its echo suitably adjusted of Chairman Mao's statement that economics is the continuation of war by other means. And he set out a very striking hypothesis. In the coming years, he said in 1993, the principal conflict of interests involving the United States and the major powers is likely to be over economic issues. US economic primacy is now being challenged, he says, by Japan, and is likely to be challenged in the future by Europe. Obviously, the United States, Japan, and Europe have common interests in promoting economic development and international trade. They also, however, have deeply conflicting interests over the distribution of the costs and benefits of economic stagnation or decline. The idea that economics is primarily a win-win sort of game is a favored conceit, he says, of tenured economists. Academics are blind to the fact that economic activity is a source of power as well as a source of well-being. It is indeed, he says, probably the most important source of power, and in a world in which military conflict between states is unlikely, economic power will be increasingly important in determining the primacy or subordination of states. And then he goes on to make a very interesting statement, which I'd just like to read to you because it's so striking. He says, in the realm of military competition, the instruments of power are missiles, planes, warships, bombs, tanks, and divisions. In the realm of economic competition, the instruments of power are productive efficiency, market control, trade surplus, currency, foreign exchange reserves, ownership of foreign companies, technologies, and factories. Now let's look at all this with some sort of historical perspective. Though the US rose to economic prominence in the period roughly 1880 to 1914, the period of the two world wars is what brought the US to political, economic, social dominance as distinct from merely prominence. Following the United States financing of the recovery via the Marshall Plan of Germany and indeed Europe as a whole, as well as Japan and later Korea, the Cold War years corresponded with US hegemony in world trade and relations in the Western Bloc. With the shrinking of the power gap between the US, Germany and the EU, and Japan and later, of course, China, a division of the world into trade blocs was anticipated. That has not happened till now, principally because demand accelerated following the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which enabled the Soviet Empire, the ex-Soviet Empire, as well as, more importantly, China and India, to enter the global capitalist economy, both as producers and as consumers. Naturally, these latter countries are also competitors to the US, though this has been held in abeyance till recently because expanding world markets compensated for or camouflaged the competition. And it's only following the decline in demand and the decline in world trade from 2007, the time the crisis began, that the true nature of the competition between countries has become clear. In the battle for shrinking markets, currency manipulation, that is to say, artificially lowering the value of your currency, has been an important aspect of enabling and supporting each country's competitive position. The issue now is whether the currency wars will be enough to resolve the issues, or whether actual wars will result, as they did when the failure of currency wars to resolve similar issues then resulted in the two world wars. With the global economic crisis from 2007, in my view, the crisis is not over yet, globalization, laissez-faire, and indeed economics as a whole discipline have fallen into question. With the shattering of the dominant Chicago school paradigm, whose rational expectations hypothesis ruled out by assumption the kind of collapse we experienced, two old masters, Friedrich von Hayek and John Maynard Keynes, have risen from the dead to renew the battles of the 1930s, though they have been equipped, this time by their followers, with explanations of what has gone wrong. And though, in my view, Wilhelm Röpke and Adam Smith are probably better guides, in the sense that at least some of their works explore the cultural, psychological, spiritual, and ethical roots of economic and political systems. In that context, I recommend to you two books, both by an Indian scholar, Dr. Vishal Mangalwadi. The first book is called Truth and Transformation, published in 2009 here in the US, and the latest book of his titled The Book That Made Your World, published last year by Thomas Nelson. Now my time is rapidly running on, so I would like to move to commenting, as I said I would, on issues of the US role in particular, not just in general or in a historical perspective, but in terms of the issues that face us today. I think the key issue for the United States is whether it will continue to operate primarily in its own self-interest, or whether it will try to build a global order which is to the benefit of the whole world. You know, US foreign policy, US strategy has always swung between two extremes. On the one hand, a realpolitik kind of extreme, in which the US simply tries to defend its own interests. And you can see this, for example, during the Bush administration, when the whole global policy of the United States was built on the single issue of security. And the other pole, which is a pole represented by the idealism of the city on a hill and all that, you know, the US idealism, the kinds of values about the United States which attract most people in the world to the United States. I don't mean necessarily to immigrate here, of course that happens too, but makes America an admirable kind of country. And you can see that articulated, for example, in the first, sort of around the middle of President Clinton's his first term, where he put forward the idea that we are not interested, America is not interested in simply defense, it is interested in engagement and enlargement. In other words, America wants to build democracy, America wants to build the right kinds of values, what America sees as the right kinds of values, and of course it's interested in defense, but seeing that defense and that security as part of a larger package of engagement and enlargement. This is, of course, something President Obama also indicated that he was wanting to follow. And yet, of course, how far he's been able to deliver it is open to question because, as we know, the political bickering between the two parties and the stalemate in Congress and Senate has meant that he has been able to do very little, at least so far as I can see. Now, just to run through one or two of these aspects that I mentioned were worth thinking about. When you look at monetary strategy, the United States has played a very questionable role, whether in terms of security or in terms of engagement and enlargement. If you think back to 1971, I think it was, the United States unilaterally broke an international treaty that it had helped to put together. It had, in fact, been responsible for putting together the Bretton Woods Agreement, according to which all currencies in the civilized world, in the kind of respectable part of the world, would base their currencies on gold. Now, I'm not arguing that it's necessary to base your currencies on gold. Please don't misunderstand me. But that was the international treaty. And the United States broke that treaty unilaterally. Now, what was the advantage or disadvantage of breaking that treaty unilaterally? The advantage was that the huge Vietnam War debt that had been built up could now be paid off in dollars that were worth less than the dollars in which the debt was held. In other words, let's say a dollar would buy a loaf of bread, one loaf of bread at the time that the debt was incurred. Now, with the devalued dollars that were possible with a dollar not tied to gold, you might need $2 to buy a loaf of bread, or $3 to buy a loaf, or $4 to buy a loaf of bread. So this was, of course, great for the United States. It could pay off the debt in cheaper dollars than was anticipated by the people who loaned the money. But the second thing, and this is probably equally important, was that the United States could now manipulate the value of its currency because it was no longer tied to how much gold it held. What is the advantage of a currency that you can manipulate? You can, of course, control much more easily the speed of growth that is taking place, because when you want to increase the rate of growth, you can put more money in the market. When you want to slow the rate of growth down, you can withdraw money from the market, and you don't need to worry about how much gold there is sitting in your basement. So the United States unleashed a new spurt of growth from the 1970s because of its power to manipulate its own currency. Now, the interesting thing is, other countries watching this were not going to sit around and leave their currencies linked to gold and therefore to the limitations of having a gold-based currency. What are the limitations of a gold-based currency? You are stuck with the amount of gold you have. If you've got less gold, you can only print less currency. You've got more gold, of course you can print more currency. You can't manipulate the value of a currency quite as easily, therefore you cannot be in control of the speed of growth of your economy as much as you'd like to. So naturally, other countries followed the advantage of the example of Big Brother United States and also abandoned their gold base and started manipulating the currency. Now, of course, we like to accuse the United States likes to accuse China of manipulating its currency, but who did they learn to manipulate currency from? And one of the big issues, I think, before the world is, sorry, I should make one more comment before I come on to that. The disadvantage of a non-gold or silver or GDP-based currency is that you can have much greater growth, but that much greater growth comes at the cost of much greater volatility and vulnerability. Because the speed of growth is dependent on the cleverness of your Federal Reserve or other central bankers. And we have seen the disadvantage of this highly growth-oriented but highly volatile and highly vulnerable economy that the United States first built and other countries have now followed because we have had both the dot-com bust in the past, we had the Southeast Asian bust, and now, since 2007, we've had the current bust. And the question is, do we want to have this kind of highly volatile kind of growth, or should we not rather go for a much more stable kind of growth? Stable growth, of course, is not dependent purely on currency. It's dependent on all kinds of other things. But the kind of currency you have is an important component of whether your growth is slow and steady, or whether it is high growth with extreme volatility and vulnerability. So one of the roles for the United States going forward is, I think, to construct a stable currency order, a stable monetary order worldwide. And we can work through all the rest of the topics in a similar way. asking ourselves whether the United States is going to see its role primarily in terms of self-interest, or is going to see its role primarily as a constructor of the right kind of global order. Now, when I make that kind of statement, I find a lot of Americans saying, but if we try to construct a global order, who will police the global order? And the answer is always the same. We, in the United States, have been trying to construct a global order, not only since the Second World War, but before that, not only with the United Nations, but with the League of Nations before that. And every time we have tried to construct a system of rules and regulations with assigned authorities whose job it is to make sure that the system is being policed in the right kind of way. You can look at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, you can look at the United Nations Security Council, you can look at the World Trade Agreement and the WTO. In each of these cases, the United States has played a role. But the question is, does the United States still want to play that role? And does it want to play that role in a way that is purely oriented towards its own self-interest? Or does it want to play its role in such a way that the right global rules are built up? My prediction is the following, that if the United States continues to pursue simply its own self-interest, then before very long we will be in for a series of wars, not just the kind of 9/11 kind of attacks, unfortunate as it was. We will see very real wars beginning to break out. And if the United States does build the right kind of global order, then we will not only escape that fate, but we will build the possibility of a humane and socially responsible future for the globe as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Prabhu Guptara, and I think you examined the roles from the geo-economic perspective very, very succinctly, the two countries, and talking about the new global order. I think that's a great, it frames new discussions and new dialogues. How are we going to be policing it? Is it going to be humane? Is it going to be from a spiritual angle? There's so much to be done on that. So we will leave that Q&A later on.